This weekend, American women woke up to a country remade. 50 years of constitutional abortion rights gone overnight. At least 10 states effectively banned abortion since Friday's decision, and women with procedures scheduled found their appointments canceled. An additional 16 states have laws that indicate they could outlaw or set pretty sharp limits on abortions, according to the Guttmacher Institute. All over the country, protesters flooded the streets to demonstrate against the court decision overturning Roe v. Wade. But the fight in the streets is only the beginning. Courts will almost certainly be flooded with challenges to bans in the coming months and years. To talk more about the Supreme Court decision and what it might mean for the country, I'm joined by Emily Bazelon, staff writer at the New York Times Legal Magazine, who writes often and brilliantly about legal affairs. Emily, welcome. I want to start by asking if you can frame this decision in terms of history. How often does the Supreme Court, take back a constitutional right that it has granted for 2 generations?
Not often at all. I really can't think of a precedent for rolling back an individual civil right that people, especially women, have depended on for 5 decades. The court changes its mind on occasion, but not in this direction. We usually see the court trying to expand people's rights over time. And this is a direction that is entirely the opposite from the point of view of women especially, and people generally.
And what I'm struck by is the method of reasoning, and the dissents point this out. So when you look at a ruling like Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed for segregation, when Brown versus Board of Education overturned that and said, we made a mistake, what it cited was decades of social science evidence that showed that the contention in Plessy versus Ferguson, which was that separate is equal, was not true in education in particular. That having separate education for blacks and whites was inherently unequal. So they were citing facts on the ground that had changed. This ruling doesn't do any of that, right?
Right. I mean, we're really going in the opposite direction. So in this case, we have more and more evidence that abortion is safe and effective and crucial for women's advancements in society. There is really good social science. And so the court claimed a comparison between overturning Roe and overturning Plessy. But in fact, if you're thinking about evidence and if you're thinking about people's individual rights, those decisions are diametrically opposite in their effect.
So what do you think this tells us about the court going forward? There was an article in the New York Times that said, what this means is that John Roberts has become the most inconsequential Chief Justice in a long time because he has no moderating power. He tried to find a way to split the difference, to find a kind of compromise. And now that there is this solid conservative majority, he's kind of irrelevant.
That's exactly right. He has been sidelined along with his moderating impulses. And what we see here are 5 conservative justices that are really determined to change the law in a way that is going to affect Americans' lives directly. You talked about the decision from New York, which makes it harder for states and localities to control their own gun safety laws. And now we have this huge upending of reproductive rights across the country. So you really see a court that is willing to maximally use its power in a conservative direction. And the question will be, what the American people decide to do about that over time.
Clarence Thomas says that the court now, this is one justice and was not joined by others, says that the natural consequence of overturning Roe would be to rethink gay marriage, to rethink access to contraception, or all that kind of thing, because in a sense it all came out of the same idea that there was a right to privacy, famously described by Blackmun as existing within the penumbras of the Constitution.
Right. So all of these decisions rely on an interpretation of the 14th Amendment that's based on privacy and a conception of liberty. And this conservative majority does not buy into that thinking. So for the moment, Justice Thomas is the only justice saying out loud that these other decisions, same-sex marriage, contraception, are also called into question. But it's entirely possible there is more support for that on the court. And I think that while, the court would say that public opinion and public response is not relevant to its considerations, we know over history that that's not true. And so how far the court goes really will be, at least in part, a response to the way Americans respond to this decision overturning Roe and the signals the political system sends to the court about what people are willing to tolerate when the court seems to really move far away from American popular opinion.
Emily, always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much. Next on GPS, from abortion rights at home to abortion rights around the world. How did the U.S. under Roe compare to other countries, and how does it compare now? That's when we come back.